Welcome to part 2 of Divided by Time. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for an awesome collection of unique, full-length audiobooks. And be sure to subscribe to be notified when new books are released. Chapter 7. Fred Gregory, the PR guy from the Valley Company, was chatting away. Bassett, calm and only mildly interested, watched the first act unfold. By the end, he recognized the star's talent. She'd grown even more impressive, though his nostalgic memories of her seemed fonder than the current reality. "She's killing it," he said as the curtain fell. Next to his solid frame, Gregory's presence faded. Even his flashy spats and pricey suit couldn't elevate him beyond his appearance, a small, polished man with cold eyes and a too-frequent smile. "She's the best," Gregory commented. He hesitated, then added, "She's my sister, you know. For business reasons, I keep that quiet." Bassett glanced at him. "Really? Well, I'm glad she made a comeback. Too good to disappear." But Gregory didn't bite. His blank eyes scanned the room as the house lights came up. "This whole tour's been a hit. She's the best, and the audience knows it." "Does she know it?" Bassett asked. "She doesn't exhibit any diva behavior, if that's what you mean. He cut himself off, suddenly gripping the railing, leaning forward and staring into the crowd. Bassett, watching him, was surprised. It took a lot to rattle a PR guy, but Gregory looked like he'd seen a ghost. After a moment, Gregory straightened, licking his dry lips. "There's a guy down there, the 6th row, next to the aisle. There's a girl in a blue dress beside him. See him, know who he is." "Never seen him before." Gregory continued to stare for a couple of minutes, then moved to the side of the house, leaning against the wall, still intently observing the man. After a while, he turned around and, moving behind the boxes, headed into the wings. Bassett's curiosity piqued, especially when Gregory reappeared soon after, bringing a small, scruffy man who seemed to be the stage manager. The small man stared, nodded, watched for a moment, and then disappeared, while Gregory went back to leaning against the side wall. Throughout the final act, Gregory didn't glance at the stage once. He kept his eyes fixed on the man sitting in the 6th row by the aisle, and Bassett kept observing the little man. His years of experience made him attuned to picking up on potential stories. He couldn't be certain, but the situation intrigued him. As the play ended, Bassett mingled with the audience, edging closer to the man and girl who had grabbed Gregory's attention, following them out to the street. He saw a tall man with a quiet but distinguished demeanor and a young, excited girl who seemed flushed from the evening's events. They walked a short distance up the street and got into a small, worn-out car. Bassett carefully noted the car's license number. Still curious and highly interested, he briskly walked around to the stage entrance, nodded to the doorkeeper, and went in. Gregory was nowhere in sight, but the stage manager was there, directing the breakdown of the last set. "I'm waiting for Gregory," Bassett said. "He hasn't fainted, has he?" "What do you mean, fainted?" the stage manager shot back, a hint of hostility in his voice. "I was with him when he thought he recognized someone. You know who? Tell him I got the car's license number." The stage manager's hostility eased, and he took the bait. "So you know about it then?" "I was with him when he saw the guy. Unfortunately, I couldn't help him out." "It's possible it's just a coincidence. I have no idea. Look at the facts. The guy's supposed to be dead. 10 years dead. His money had been split a dozen ways from Sunday. Back when I knew him, I don't think even he would have had the guts to come here and sit through a performance. Although," he added thoughtfully, "Judd Clark had the nerve for anything." Bassett handed him a cigar and headed out to the alley that led to the street. Once there, he stood still, softly whistling. Judd Clark. If that was really Judson Clark, he had the story of a lifetime. He wandered the empty city streets, mulling over the possibility that Gregory might be right. Sometime after midnight, he returned to the office and the filing room. For 2 hours, he pored over old files of the paper, methodically making brief notes in a memo. At 2 a.m., he put away the files, leaned back and lit a cigar. Everything was there. The enormous Clark fortune inherited by a boy who had gone crazy over Beverly Carlisle, her marriage to her leading man, Howard Lucas, the subsequent killing of Lucas by Clark at his Wyoming ranch, and Clark's escape into the mountains. The sensational details of Clark's obsession, the dramatic crime, his escape, and the certainty of his death during a mountain storm had filled the newspapers for weeks. Judson Clark had been famous, notorious, infamous, and supposedly dead, all in under 2 years. A shameful and somehow pitiful story. But even if Judson Clark had died, the story lived on. Every so often it resurfaced. 3 years ago, he had been declared legally dead, and his vast estate, as per the will of old Elihu Clark, had gone to universities and hospitals. But rumors persisted. Judd Clark was living in India. He had a cattle ranch in Venezuela. He had been seen on the streets of New Orleans. Bassett ran through the situation in his mind. First, let's consider that Clark was indeed alive and had been at the theater that night. This meant believing several things. Believing, for instance, that Clark could sit there with a girl beside him, watching the woman for whom he had wrecked his life, in a play he once knew by heart. Believing he could laugh and applaud, then calmly walk away when it was over, with all the memories he must carry. Believing, too, that he had somehow survived his dramatic disappearance, crafted a new identity, and found a new place for himself. The girl beside him even suggested possible new relationships. At 2:30 a.m., Bassett closed his notebook, stuffed it into his pocket, and headed home. As he walked past the Ardmore Hotel, he glanced up at its windows. Gregory had probably told her by now. He wondered, somewhat amused, whether the stage manager had informed Gregory about his questions, and whether they might fear him more than Clark himself. After all, they had nothing to fear from Clark, if he was indeed Clark. No, what worried them, knowing he had caught wind of a potential situation, was the revival of an old story she had fought hard to bury. She was ambitious, and the country was undergoing a rigorous moral revival. What might have once worked in her favor could now be a severe liability. He slowed down, lost in thought. It was a strange story, maybe stranger than it seemed. Gregory had looked frightened rather than just surprised. The man had even gone pale. Motive, that was the key. What was the motive behind each action? Conscious or unconscious, every deliberate act had a motive. He wondered how she had reacted when Gregory had told her. Interestingly, Beverly Carlisle had shown less anxiety than her brother. Still pale and shaken, he had gone straight to her dressing room when the curtain fell, knocked, and entered. She sat tiredly in a chair, cigarette in hand. The dressing room was a typical post-show mess. Powders, rouge, pencils scattered along the shelf under the mirror, a bunch of roses in the basin, a wardrobe trunk, and a maid covering the evening's costumes with protective bags. It went okay, don't you think, Fred? Yeah, he answered distractedly. Alice, can you step out for a bit? I'll call you back in a few minutes. He waited until the door closed. What's up? She asked, not very interested. If it's more drama with the cast, I don't want to hear it. I'm exhausted. Then she really looked at him and sat up straight. Fred, what's wrong? He didn't sugarcoat it. I think Judson Clark was in the audience tonight. No way. I'd think the same if someone told me, he grumbled. But I saw him. Don't you think I'd know him? If you don't believe me, ask Saunders. I got him out front. He recognized him too. You pulled in Saunders. Why wouldn't I? Bev, I was freaking out. I still am. What did Saunders say? If Clark wasn't supposed to be dead, he'd swear it was him. Now she was worried, but more composed than he was. She tapped the shelf with a nail file, thinking. Okay, she said. Let's say it was him. So what? He's been in hiding for 10 years. Why would he come out now unless he needed money? Was he dressed poorly? No, Fred said grumpily. He was with a girl, looked fine. You didn't tell anyone but Saunders. No, I'm not that crazy. I should talk to Joe, she decided. Go get him, Fred, and tell Alice she can leave. She stood and started tidying up, finding comfort in the activity. She was still beautiful, with pronounced features and graceful movements. Without her makeup, The illusion of her youth vanished, revealing traces of past suffering and current stress. She felt uneasy and resentful, more startled than alarmed. Logic told her that Judson Clark, if he was still alive and had been there that night, wanted to leave the past behind as much as she did. As she moved around, she was surprised to find herself trembling. Her brother returned, and she turned to face him. To her shock, he stood inside the door, pale and staring at her with wild eyes. Saunders, the idiot. He's let it slip. He stumbled to a chair, wiping his trembling lips with a handkerchief. He told Bassett from the Times-Republican, he managed to say. Do you understand what this means? And Bassett got Clark's car number. He mentioned it. He looked up at her, his face twitching. They're like bloodhounds, Bev. They're going to uncover everything. You know, I've been ready for this. I've been expecting it for 10 years. I know. His emotions surged, and he reached out to hold her hand. Poor Bev, he said. Especially after all your hard work to rebuild. It's a real shame. She was calmer than he was, less convinced overall, and always better balanced. She let him stroke her hand, standing beside him with eyes distant and a bit hard. I should probably verify it was Judd first, he suggested after a while, and then warn him. Why? Bassett will be after him. No, she snapped. No, Fred, leave it alone. You're creating an imaginary problem, and you're not thinking clearly. A lot of different things could happen. What likely happened is that Bassett's at home, asleep in bed. She sent him to get a taxi soon after, and they went back to the hotel. But later, alone in her suite at the Ardmore, she didn't go to bed immediately. She slipped into a robe and stood by her window for a long while, gazing out. Instead of city lights, she saw a range of snow-capped mountains. Nestled at their base was the Clark Ranch house, built by an old millionaire as an occasional escape from the grind of life. There, he had raised and trained his prized horses for racing. It was also where he took his wife for their honeymoon after marrying late in life, and where they returned 2 years later for the birth of their son. When she died, he came back with his child, broken and aged before his time, only to be killed by one of his own stallions when the boy was 15. Left on his own, Judson had been 21 when she met him, barely a year younger than her. He was living fast, throwing money around recklessly. He had backed her career as a star, sourcing stage props from all over Europe. Then he fell in love with her. The memory made her shiver. It had been desperate and terrifying because she cared for someone else. As she stood by the window, she pondered, as she had numerous times over the past decade, what would have happened if she had married Judson Clark instead of Howard? Would he have settled down? Sometimes it felt like even in his wildest moments, he was just playing a game that amused him. A part of him, inherited from his father, watched with a sort of detached interest at his own antics, as if he was playing his wild game with his tongue in his cheek. She moved away from the window, turned off the lights, and got into bed. Feeling depressed and lonely, she cried a little. After a while, she remembered she hadn't applied any cream to her face. She got up and went through the familiar routine in the dark. Chapter 8. Dick sang in the shower with gusto. In the revamped old stable, housing both Neddy and the little car, Mike was indiscriminately hosing them down, his trusty old pipe clenched between his teeth. From downstairs wafted the mouth-watering aroma of frying sausages and freshly brewed strong coffee. The world felt like a wonderful place, a fine old place. It had its balance of work, play, and love. Office hours, visits, and golf outings filled the days, alongside the sweet, tender presence of feminine charm that always needed care and attention. She liked him. She didn't think he was old. She thought his profession was the best in the world. She had even wondered if he would have time to visit her someday. Time. As he shaved in front of the slightly warped bathroom mirror, he seriously considered if it was too soon to drop by that afternoon, just to see if she was tired or had caught a cold. Maybe tomorrow would be better. No, today was the day. On his way from the bathroom to his bedroom, he leaned over the staircase. "Aunt Lucy," he called. "Yes, Dick." "Good morning. Do you think Minnie would have time to press my blue trousers this morning?" He heard her chair scraping back in the dining room, a conversation in the kitchen, and then Minnie appeared below him. "Just toss them down, Dr. Dick," she said. "I've got a hot iron ready." "One day, Minnie," he declared, "you'll wear a halo and sing with the angels." This burst of unreasoning happiness carried him through the morning. He moved from house to house, appropriately serious and responsible, but with a small song in his heart. Around 11 o'clock, he managed to stop by the village haberdasher's to pick out a new tie, which he had wrapped and stuffed in his pocket. Later, on a country road in the broad daylight, he found himself questioning its bright, bold color. At lunch, he was almost exuberant, and David matched his mood, albeit a bit awkwardly. But Lucy was lost in her thoughts. She felt an invisible pressure, like ghosts from the past reaching out to trap them. Mrs. Morgan, Beverly Carlisle, Dick possibly falling in love, and considering a return to Norada, it all haunted her. Unlike David, who was relieved that one crisis had passed, she saw their future as a series of such predicaments, with accompanying stress and potential danger. She could hardly eat. Later that afternoon, as she admitted a new patient for Dick, she had no inkling of the trouble ahead. She directed a tall, healthy-looking man, probably in his late 30s, to the waiting room before quietly retreating to her sitting room for her weekly mending. On his part, Louis Bassett felt a growing discomfort. The old house radiated a sense of quiet respectability, with the domestic aroma of baking cake filling the air, making his mission seem almost absurd. Linking his errand with Judson Clark and his tumultuous past felt silly. Officially, he was there for a neuralgic headache. By the time he stepped into Dick's consulting room, hat in hand, he had decided he would put his overactive imagination to rest, get a prescription, and walk out, trying to forget a chance resemblance had led him here. But as he observed the man sitting across from him in the swivel chair, he wavered. The figure was tall, with thick brown hair, familiar features, and a boyish smile, just like the photograph he'd seen the night before. This man looked exactly how Judson Clark might have at 32. He explained his visit smoothly, just in town for the day, prone to headaches, especially over his right eye, possibly needing glasses. It couldn't be Clark. It just couldn't be. Judd Clark, leaning back in an old chair, was asking questions about his supposedly fake pain. It seemed absurd, but he wanted to clear his mind and get some rest that night. So after taking his prescription and paying for it, he began a seemingly casual interrogation. "Two names on your sign, father and son. Dr. David Livingstone is my uncle. I'd think you'd be in the city. Doesn't this kind of place have its limits?" "I like it here," Dick said, glancing at the office clerk. "Patients are like friends, I guess. Did you grow up here?" "Not exactly. I grew up on a ranch in Wyoming. My dad had a ranch out there." Bassett shot him a look, but Dick was calm and slightly smiling. "Wyoming, that's pretty far from here, anywhere near those new oil fields." "Not far from Norada, which is the center of the oil action," Dick said good-naturedly. He stood up and glanced at the clock again. "If those headaches keep up, you should get your eyes checked." Bassett was confused. It seemed to him that there had been a hint of evasion in Dick's demeanor, a bit less openness in his eyes. But Dick showed no excitement, nothing sneaky or alarmed, and his unsolicited mention of Norada threw Bassett off. He had to consider whether it was possible a man strongly resembling Judson Clark came from the same area, or— "Norada," he said. "That's where the big Clark ranch was, right? Ever run into Judson Clark?" "Our place was pretty isolated." Bassett found himself politely ushered out, more confused than when he walked in, and a bit irritated. His annoyance wasn't helped by the calm voice behind him saying, "Drink plenty of water when you take that stuff. Some stomachs can't handle it well." The door closed. The reporter stood in the waiting room for a moment, then put on his hat. "Well, I'm a damn fool," he muttered, and headed out onto the street. He felt disappointed and a bit embarrassed. Life was full of strange twists, that was all. No resemblance or coincidence of birthplace could convince him that Judson Clark, the runaway and troublemaker, had suddenly turned into someone who stayed up all night caring for sick kids or delivering babies. After a while, he remembered the prescription in his hand. He considered tearing it up, but decided to examine it first, then carefully placed it in his wallet. After all, some things did seem odd. The guy had definitely dodged his last question. He walked to the station with his head down. With 10 minutes to kill, he wandered over to the newsstand. He casually browsed the display, bought a newspaper, and was about to leave when he noticed a man who had just gotten off a train. The reporter looked after him with amused interest. Gregory, too. This Livingstone guy had definitely stirred things up. But it was strange. How had Gregory tracked him down? Wasn't there something unusual about Gregory being here? Maybe Gregory, like him, just wanted to confirm if the man was Clark or not. Or maybe Gregory was convinced it was Clark and wanted to give him a heads-up. But if Gregory had tracked him down, didn't that mean Clark had contacted him? Was this guy actually Clark? Gregory asked a cab driver for directions and started down the street. After thinking it over for a moment, Bassett decided to follow him. He was getting more interested and feeling more optimistic. Hanging back, he carried his rolled-up newspaper and walked briskly like the other commuters heading home for their early suburban dinners. Halfway down Station Street, Gregory stopped in front of the Livingstone house, read the sign, and rang the doorbell. The reporter slowed his pace, giving Gregory time to get inside, then passed by slowly. He stopped in front of Harrison Miller's house and waited. He lit a cigarette and took a good look around the old place. It was strange to think that this could be where Judson Clark had hidden out. The old two-story brick house with a rickety stable out back, a small vegetable garden, and a few patches of simple garden flowers spread over about half an acre. A doctor, a pill pusher, Judd Clark. Chapter 9. She had that sparkle in her eyes. She kept replaying every moment of their otherwise uneventful evening together, recalling little things he said and did, and how she had responded. For instance, she had casually mentioned Clare Tessler, very casually, of course. He had said, "Clare Tessler. Oh, right, the tall blonde girl, isn't she?" She was on cloud nine. He didn't seem to think she was too young or immature. He asked her opinion on some important things, and really listened when she answered. Yet she knew she had a lot to learn compared to him, and she was determined to start reading seriously. Her mom found her that afternoon, curled up in the library, starting the first volume of Gibbon's Rome, with fierce concentration, wearing her best summer dress. Clearly, she wasn't planning to rely only on Gibbon's Rome. "Are you expecting someone, Elizabeth?" her mom asked, with that straightforwardness moms always have. Elizabeth, mentally fixing a date with firm determination, looked up absently and said, "No one in particular." By 3 o'clock, with a slight headache from all that concentration, she went upstairs and redid her hair, this time higher, hoping it'd make her feel taller. Of course, it wasn't likely he'd come. He was really busy, after all. So many people depended on him. It must be amazing to have people needing you, always looking out the door saying, "I think I see him coming now." Still, her heart leapt when the postman rang the bell and then stopped. When Annie slowly climbed the stairs, she was already on her feet, but it was only a card announcing, "Mrs. Sayer, Wednesday, May 15th, luncheon at 1:30. Yet at 4:30, the bell rang again, and a masculine voice informed Annie it would leave its overcoat here, because recently a dog had eaten a piece of it and got horrible indigestion. The time it took Annie to get back up, the stairs gave her a moment to catch her breath, and when she came back down, she moved so carefully and with such poise that he initially thought she wasn't happy to see him. "I came, as you see," he said. "I planned to wait until tomorrow, but I had some free time. But if you're busy—" "I was reading Gibbon's Rome," she told him. "I think everyone should read it, don't you?" "Why on earth?" he asked. "I don't know." They looked at each other and suddenly burst into laughter. "I wanted to improve my mind," she explained. "I felt last night that you know so many things, and I was terribly ignorant." "Do you mean to say," he asked, shocked, "that I, great Scott?" Settled in the living room, they quickly fell back into their easy rapport from the night before, and he felt compelled to be honest. "I didn't really plan to wait until tomorrow," he admitted. "I woke up fully intending to come here today, even if it meant neglecting my practice. At 11 this morning, I postponed a consultation for 10 minutes to go to Yardsley's and buy a tie specifically for this visit. Maybe you've noticed it. I have indeed. It's a wonderful tie. Neat but not loud, right? He grinned at her, pleased. You know, you might want to help me with my ties. I have the taste of a color-blind artist. I almost bought a purple one with red stripes, and Aunt Lucy thinks I should wear white linen like David. They chatted about those little meaningful nothings that serve as a front for the deep, silent exchange of questions and answers between young people in love. They had known each other for years, exchanging the same casual neighborhood talk as they did now. Today, nothing had changed, yet everything had. Then, out of nowhere, he said, "I might be going away soon, Elizabeth." He watched her closely. She had a distinct sense that beneath everything that afternoon there was something unsaid, something that involved her. Maybe it was the way he spoke. "You're not planning to stay, are you?" "No, I want to go back to Wyoming, where I was born, just for a few weeks." And in that, just for a few weeks, lay some of the unspoken truths, that he would miss her and come back quickly, that she would miss him, and he subconsciously knew it, and behind that a promise. He would return to her. "Just for a few weeks," he repeated. "I thought maybe, if you wouldn't mind me writing to you now and then. I have terrible handwriting, you know. Most doctors do." "I would love that," she said, trying to sound formal. Suddenly she felt very lonely, as if he had already left, and a bit resentful, not at him, but at the way things were. And anyway, everyone knew that once a Westerner, always a Westerner. The West always called its children. Not that she saw it that way, but she had a sort of image, from movies, of a land of wide-open spaces and tall mountains, where men wore rugged clothes and women rode wild horses with the type of spirit she felt she lacked. She was swept by a vague jealousy. "You might never come back," she said, offhandedly. "After all, you were born there, and we must seem very quiet to you." "Quiet?" he exclaimed. "You are wonderfully restful and comforting. You—" He stopped himself and stood up. "So I'll write, and you'll try to decipher my terrible writing and respond. Is that a deal? I'll tell you all the town gossip." "If you dare," he teased. "You're to tell me what you're up to and all about yourself. Remember, I'm counting on you." Their voices might have been light, but there was a shared understanding between them, a bond meant to hold them together through their impending separation. It felt a bit anticlimactic, then, when he admitted he wasn't sure exactly when he could leave. She walked him to the door and stood there, her soft hair blowing gently as he got into the car. As he turned the corner and glanced back, she was still standing there. Feeling quite happy and affable, he offered a ride to an elderly woman from the village, going considerably out of his way to take her home. He got back to the office at 6:30 to find Minnie, red-eyed, waiting in the hall. Chapter 10. David unlocked the door with his key, hung up his overcoat on the old walnut hat rack, and headed into his office. He felt the exhaustion from the past few days weighing heavily on him. The recent events had taken their toll, and he wasn't feeling entirely well. He'd even dozed off in his buggy, waking up to find old Nettie slowly making her way down the main street, veering toward home in an erratic but determined path, while folks on the sidewalk watched and chuckled. He entered his office, shut the door, and stretched out on the old leather couch with its sagging springs, hoping to catch up on his sleep. But almost immediately the doorbell rang, and Minnie came in a moment later. "There's a gentleman to see you, Dr. David." With a sigh, he got up clumsily, adjusted his collar, and opened the door to his waiting room. "Come in," he said, with a hint of resignation. Standing up from a chair was a small, neat man wearing the very type of clothes David despised, complete with light-colored spats. The man looked at David with evident surprise. "I think I've made a mistake. Last night, a Doctor Livingstone left his seat number for calls at the box office of the Annex Theater during the Happy Valley show, but he was a younger man." David's expression hardened, though he calmly surveyed the visitor from under his bushy white eyebrows. "I haven't been to a theater in a dozen years, sir." Gregory was starting to believe he had indeed made a mistake. Much like Louis Bassett, He found it hard to imagine Judd Clark being associated with the old house's domestic atmosphere and dignified tranquility, making Gregory feel out of place and foolish. He was about to apologize and leave when a thought struck him. There are 2 names on your sign. Was the other doctor, by any chance, at the theater last night? David's expression remained stoic as he replied slowly, I think I need a reason for these inquiries. He was trying to place Gregory, to fit him into the situation, straining his memory over a decade of security without success. What exactly are you here to find out? He asked, as Gregory glanced around the room. The other Doctor Livingstone is your brother. My nephew. Gregory shot him a sharp look, but all he saw was an elderly man with heavy white hair, fierce, shaggy eyebrows, and a portly, dignified demeanor. The man seemed resentfully courteous. Sorry to trouble you, Gregory said. I suppose I've made a mistake. Is your nephew at home? No. Do you have a picture of him that I could see? David fought the wild urge to lash out at Gregory, to knock him down. His collar felt too tight, and he tugged at it. Not unless you tell me why you want to see it. He's tall, rather thin, and he took a young woman to the theater last night, Gregory persisted. Yes, that sounds like him. Why? And he's your nephew. My brother's son, David replied steadily. It began to dawn on him that this strange visitor was not hostile, just anxious and uneasy. There was almost a pleading look in Gregory's eyes, as if he was ready to offer trust in exchange for trust. Plus, a stubborn determination, as if he had come with a purpose he was set on fulfilling. Sit down, David said, calming a bit. My nephew isn't hiding the fact that he went to the theater last night. Now, if you'll tell me who you are. But Gregory didn't sit. He stood where he was, watching David intently. I'm not sure what it means to you, Doctor, but I am Beverly Carlisle's brother. David sank into his chair. His knees suddenly felt weak, but he managed to control his voice. I see, he said, and waited. Something happened at the theater last night. It might be important. I need to see your nephew to confirm it. I can't afford any mistakes. David's face lost its color. He opened a desk drawer and pulled out a photograph of Dick in his uniform. Maybe this will help. Gregory studied the picture closely, even taking it to the window for better light. When he turned back to David, he seemed more sure of himself and his mission, and his demeanor had shifted. Yes, it does. He placed the photograph on the desk and pulled his chair closer to David. I won't use any names, Doctor. I think you know what I'm getting at. I was mostly certain last night. Now I'm sure. David nodded. Go on. Let's start with a hypothetical. Imagine a man who, when drunk, commits a crime and then disappears. He leaves behind a bad reputation and a huge fortune. Later he reforms, becomes a valuable citizen, and everything is buried. Dr. David listened without a hint of emotion. Gregory lowered his voice. Imagine there's a woman involved, not guilty of anything but caught up in the rumors. She manages to live it down for 10 years, returns to her profession, stars in a family play, and her career takes off. It's easy to see that neither of those two wants the past dug up, right? David cleared his throat. You mean there's a risk of it resurfacing? I believe so, Gregory said bitterly. I recognized him last night and called someone who knew him back then, Saunders, our stage manager. Then a reporter named Bassett got it out of Saunders. You know what that means? David listened, though it felt like from a great distance. You can imagine what this means to Bassett. If he's figured it out, it's the story of a lifetime. I thought he should be warned. David sat silently, gripping the arms of his old chair, while Gregory reached for his hat and stood up. He needs to leave town for a while, Gregory said. This Bassett guy is relentless. He's from the Times-Republican, and he took your nephew's car license number. Still, David said nothing, and Gregory moved toward the door. Get him out of here, tonight if possible. Thank you, David replied thickly. "I appreciate you coming." Dazed, he stood up as Gregory said, "Good night," and left. The room seemed unusually dark and unsteady, unfamiliar even. So this was what had happened after all those safe years. A man could work, build, and pray, but if his house was built on sand. As the outer door closed, David collapsed to the floor with a crash. Chapter 11. Bassett stood in front of the neat, old brick house, the bushes trimmed with a bachelor's precise touch. He couldn't help but wonder what was happening behind those tidy, curtained windows. Should he ring the bell again, come up with an excuse to see if he could catch a glimpse of a potential drama unfolding inside? Especially if the man he suspected really was Clark, drama was almost guaranteed. He quickly dismissed the idea and resumed his watchful survey of the place. Whoever chose this hideout for Clark, assuming it was him, had done a brilliant job. The town reeked of respectability, tree-lined streets, kids in clean, crisp clothes, houses set back in perfectly mown lawns, all of it peaceful, boring, and thoroughly middle class. The last place you'd expect to find someone like Judson Clark. He grinned a bit grimly, thinking that if Gregory had identified correctly, he might be inside, warning Clark about Bassett. Gregory would know how relentless Bassett could be. Just then, the door opened, and Gregory emerged, heading toward the station. Bassett caught up with him and grabbed his arm. "So," he said brightly, "it was him, wasn't it?" Gregory stopped and gave him a hard look. Then he sneered. "If your brain worked as well as your nose, Bassett, you'd be an amazing reporter." "Don't worry about my brain. It's having a good day." So what did he have to say? Gregory, taking a moment to gather himself, replied more calmly, "We're leaving together. That guy isn't Judd Clark and never was. He's a doctor, the old Dark's nephew. They practice together." "Did you see them both?" "Yes." Bassett scrutinized Gregory. Either Gregory was a fantastic actor, or the trail had gone cold for real. After his conversation with Dick, he felt like they were chasing the wrong lead. Gregory had barely been in the house for 10 minutes, enough time to recognize a mistake, but not enough for any dramatic reveal. It was disappointing, but he was used to that. After a moment, he just said, "Well, that's that. He sure looked like Clark to me." "Yeah, he did." "You surprised him, didn't you?" "Oh, he was fine," Gregory said. "I didn't tell him anything, obviously." Bassett checked his watch. "I was definitely on your trail," he said cheerfully. "But if I was mistaken, that's it. I don't need a hammer over the head to get the message. Come, I'll buy you a soda. We have time before the 7 o'clock train." But Gregory declined. "No, thanks. I'll just head to the station and grab a newspaper." The reporter smiled, knowing Gregory was still annoyed at him for the long night and day they had endured. "All right," he said affably. "See you at the train. I'll just walk around for a bit." He turned and walked back up the street leisurely. He hated being fooled, and fooled he had been. It wasn't just Gregory who had lost sleep. Then, out of nowhere, he heard someone call from the curb, and to his surprise, it was Dick Livingstone. "Need a lift?" Dick asked. "How's the headache?" "Better, thanks," Bassett replied, staring at him. "No, just killing time till the train. Are you heading home or just out?" "Going home. Glad to hear your head's better." He drove off, leaving Bassett standing there, puzzled. So Gregory had lied. He hadn't seen this guy at all. But why? Bassett continued walking, deep in thought. Why make up such an elaborate story if Gregory had just gone in, waited briefly, and left? It didn't make sense. Something inside the house had convinced Gregory he was right. He had seen someone or something. There was no need for him to lie. He could have just said he hadn't seen anyone. But instead, he spun a story to throw Bassett off track. Dick stopped in front of the house, got out, and went inside. Determined, Gregory followed him and rang the doorbell. After waiting a long time, the maid from earlier opened the door. Her eyes were red from crying, and she looked at him with hostility. "Is Dr. Richard Livingstone here?" "You can't see him." "It's important." "Well, you can't. Dr. David just had a stroke. He's in the office now, on the floor. She shut the door on him. It all made sense now. Gregory hadn't seen Clark but the older man. He had told him something, and the older man collapsed from the shock. It was sad, but also quite convincing. That night he stayed up late, going over the notes in his book. As he pieced together the old story, it went like this. 12 years ago, Clark had financed Beverly Carlisle's first big break. At first, it seemed he was just trying to get her the publicity she needed. Yet he did it with a kind of youthful recklessness and creativity that grabbed the press's attention, making them chuckle whenever they met up. He assembled a group of young, wealthy, and carefree men like himself to help promote the young star. The newspapers called them Beverly Carlisle and her Broadway beauties. It was innocent, youthful, and very entertaining, but it cost Judson Clark his place in his father's conservative clubs. For a while, it shook up the theater world with escapades that were harmless, but certainly dramatic. Eventually, word spread that young Clark was in love with the leading actress. The Broadway beauties disbanded after a wild farewell dinner. The audiences stopped expecting a dozen guys in identical suits with gardenias in their buttonholes and maybe red ties, with their evening wear to stand in their boxes and bow when the star appeared. Even the star herself looked a bit less anxious. The rumor was that Judson Clark had been turned down and wasn't taking it well. Reporters spotted him, looking disheveled, hanging around the stage door, and the word was she had ditched him, money and all, for her leading man. One thing was clear. Clark, who hadn't been much of a drinker before, had started hitting the bottle hard. After a while, and probably after some unpleasant scenes, she refused to see him any more. When the play ended in June 1911, she married Howard Lucas, her leading man, his third wife. Lucas wasn't a bad guy, a handsome, rather forgettable man who liked to play poker all day on Sundays, was always well-groomed, not very sharp mentally, but pleasant. They bought a house on East 56th Street and were looking for a new play with Lucas as co-star when he suddenly started to fall apart nervously, stopped sleeping, and developed a slight twitch in his otherwise handsome, if empty, face. Judson Clark took his yacht to Europe, and the reports about him weren't too great. But when he came back in early September, he seemed to have gotten over his infatuation, looking well-dressed as usual, and announced he planned to spend the winter on his Wyoming ranch. He must have heard about Lucas's breakdown, and he probably saw them both. Whatever went down at that meeting, however he managed to ease Lucas's likely jealousy and the girl's nervousness, remained a mystery to Bassett. It was evident he had won them over, as the reporter's next note was simply a date, September 12, 1911. That was the day they all headed west together, traveling in Clark's private car, with Lucas, a bit jittery, smiling and waving from a window. The real trouble didn't hit until mid-October. Bassett leaned back, thinking it over. He had a pretty good grasp of the situation at the ranch. Daily rides, a bit of reading, and way too much of everyone's company. A sick man, unhappy in his enforced isolation, frustrated by the limitations, lonely and irritable. The girl, realizing soon enough she had made a mistake, and Clark's jealousy toward her husband. The closed door to their room, the countless small intimate moments shared between them, breakfast trays for two heading upstairs, and below that frustrated young man, seething and furiously jealous, yet managing to stay polite and act like a gentleman. Lucas eventually turned to alcohol out of sheer boredom, and Judd Clark joined him. By the end of 3 weeks, they were both drinking heavily and becoming courteously argumentative. Bassett could imagine it clearly. He pictured the girl protesting, observing them, growing increasingly worried as she saw that Clark's jealousy matched her husband's. It was a bizarre scene, he thought, the three of them cooped up on the vast ranch, with tensions mounting every day. Then one night at dinner they fought, and Beverly left the table. She was planning to pack her bags and return to New York, probably sensing that things were about to explode. While she was upstairs, Clark had shot and killed Howard Lucas, then vanished. Testimony from the inquest revealed he had run to the corral, saddled a horse, and despite the heavy snow, he had headed toward the mountains. By midnight, a group from Norada had set out, along with another team heading up Dry River Canyon. But the storm quickly escalated into a blizzard in the mountains, forcing them to turn back. Any more snow, and they wouldn't have been able to get their horses out. About a week later, the conditions improved just enough to form a crust of ice over the snow, and a few of them went out again, albeit with little hope of finding Clark alive. On the second day, they found his horse, but no sign of Clark himself. There were those who believed that, in the end, Elihu Clark's boy had taken the better path. Bassett closed his notebook and lit a cigar. There was a huge story here, just waiting to be uncovered. He could head to the office, give them a teaser, get some expense money, and be on his way to Norada by the next night. He knew he'd have to start there, and it wouldn't be easy. Witnesses from the ranch incident would be hard to find now, and even if he found them, their memories would be blurred by time or embellished over the years. The ranch itself might have changed hands. Piecing together the events from 10 years ago would be almost impossible. But that wasn't his main concern. He needed to link Norada with Haverly and Clark with Livingstone. One part of it was straightforward. If Livingstone's story checked out, that he had lived on a ranch near Norada before the crime, and as Livingstone, then he'd have to accept that two men could look exactly alike and come from the same place, yet be different people. If not. But later, as he turned off his light and got into bed, he started to feel a certain reluctance towards his self-imposed mission. If Livingstone truly were Clark, if after years of hard work he had managed to reinvent himself, becoming a responsible and valuable member of society, why bring him down? Honestly, the world hadn't lost much with Lucas gone. He was just a smooth-talking, not-so-bright big guy. Lucas decided to sleep on it, and by morning he wasn't just indifferent to the business anymore. He was completely resolved to drop it. Things were fine as they were. The woman involved was doing well. Judd was doing well. And nothing would bring Howard Lucas back to that small theatrical world that had bid him farewell at the station so long ago. He shaved and dressed, sticking to his decision. In fact, he felt a slight glow of virtue because he was making one of those unsung sacrifices that might get him some credit in the next life, as they certainly did nothing for him in this one. He was unusually friendly to the waiter who served him breakfast at his bachelor apartment, even increasing his weekly tip to $1.50. Then he sat down and opened the Times-Republican. Scanning it as usual for his own section, he frowned at a series of exclamation and question marks that had mistakenly followed the mayor's name. But on the second page, he stopped, holding his coffee cup in midair. Is Judson Clark alive? Wife of former ranch manager makes confession. A woman named Margaret Donaldson, fatally injured in a car accident near the town of Norada, Wyoming, had made a deathbed confession. She said she couldn't die without clearing her conscience, so she had called for the sheriff of Dallas County and revealed the following. After the incident at the Clark Ranch, her husband, John Donaldson, now deceased, had gone into the mountains right after the inquest, where he had testified. He hoped to find Clark alive, knowing of a deserted ranger's cabin where Clark sometimes stayed while hunting. Donaldson's plan was to search for Clark at this cabin and help him escape. He took food and brandy with him. Because of the blizzard, he was nearly frozen to death. He had to abandon his horse and shoot it before doing so. Close to death himself, he eventually reached the cabin where he found Judson Clark, the fugitive, who was very ill. She also said that her husband took care of Clark for 4 days while Clark was delirious. On the 5th day, her husband left the cabin on foot, heading back to the Clark Ranch. He locked Clark in the cabin and returned the following night with 3 horses, 2 saddled and 1 packed with food and supplies. Together with her, they went back to the mountain cabin, where she stayed to care for Clark while her husband returned to the ranch to avoid suspicion. A day or so later, she saw a man outside in the snow coming toward the cabin. Initially, she thought he was part of the search party and considered locking him out, but eventually she let him in. The man stayed and helped her take care of the sick fugitive. Sadly, the injured woman fell into a coma and later died, taking any further details with her. However, the article suggested that Judson Clark might still be alive, living under a new identity, without facing any punishment and appearing respectable. 3 years earlier, he had been declared legally dead, and his estate was divided among various legatees and charities. Nearly $100 million had been given to good causes, leaving Judson Clark, wherever he was, to fend for himself. Instead of using the country's top legal minds to defend himself, he chose to vanish. The entire situation hinged on Mrs. Donaldson's testimony, but the authorities in Norada believed she hadn't been sane for years. The cabin Margaret mentioned was well known, but no one had searched it back then. Clark's horse had been found just 10 miles from town, and the cabin was buried under snow 20 miles farther. If Clark had walked that distance, it would have been a miracle. Margaret Donaldson's confession seemed to check out. She was supposedly staying with relatives in Omaha during the winter after Judson Clark's crime, returning to the ranch the following spring. The article included a detailed description and a photo of Judson Clark. Bassett read it again carefully, muttering a few curses under his breath. If he needed any more proof to confirm his suspicions, it was right there, but everything had changed overnight. Clark was now the subject of a wide search, spanning from Maine to the Pacific coast, and even Europe and South America might be on alert. However, Bassett wasn't as worried about the police as he was about the press. Some newspapers would dig into the story, sending their top reporters. It wasn't just about solving the case. It was a chance to revive a dramatic old tale. Bassett could already picture local photographers trudging up to that cabin and sending pictures everywhere. Reporters, eager to tackle a 10-year-old mystery and track down a once-famous fugitive, would be packing their bags for Norada. No, he couldn't quit now. He had to keep going, and he had an edge. He was pretty sure he could find Clark whenever he needed to. But he had to build his case, make the connections. Who was the other man in the cabin? He must have known the identity of the boy in that rough bunk, delirious with fever. He must have known something. That made him, like the Donaldsons, an accessory after the fact and criminally liable. There was no chance he'd confess. Still, he was the crucial link. He had to be. On his third read-through, the reporter began to see the human side of the effort to save the boy. He could almost picture the whole tragic struggle unfolding. The determined ranch manager fighting through the blizzard, putting down his horse, carefully avoiding suspicion, and later the fearless woman braving that snowy night ride when the posse had given up and gone home, to reach the boy locked in the cabin, delirious. His mind was busy as he packed his suitcase. He had already shrugged off his earlier doubts and moved methodically, calculating roughly what expenses he'd need and planning his approach at the office. Between Norada and that old brick house in Haverly lay his story, 10 years' worth. He was closing his bag when he remembered the little girl in the blue dress at the theater. He paused and frowned. After a moment, he snapped the bag shut. Damn it, if Clark had decided to get involved with a girl, that was on Clark, not him. But he still felt uneasy. "It's a strange world, Joe," he said to the waiter, who had come in for the breakfast dishes. "Yes, sir, it sure is," Joe replied. Chapter 12. That evening there was a consultation. David had suffered a mild stroke, but there was no paralysis, and the prognosis was positive. This time David had dodged a bullet, but he couldn't afford another scare. He needed to stay calm, avoid stress, and stick to a strict diet. With proper care, he still had many good years ahead. David slept, his breathing heavy and slow. In the morning, a nurse would be there, but that night Dick had sent Lucy to bed and stayed up to keep watch himself. On the walnut bed lay Doctor, David's sturdy figure, faintly outlined by the shaded lamp, and Dick sat on a chair drawn close. He was wide awake and deeply worried, but as time passed with no complications, and David's sleep seemed to become more natural, Dick's thoughts began to stray. First he thought about Elizabeth, and then his mind wandered further into the future. He pictured the old house with Elizabeth waiting for him to come home. He imagined their lives intertwined, filled with children, small worries, and the routines of everyday life, with the two of them side by side. Then he began to think about himself. Over the past 10 years, he had often done this, studying his own case with a sort of professional detachment. With the advent of the new science of psychoanalysis, he had occasionally made half-hearted attempts to peer behind the veil of his own subconscious. These attempts weren't very genuine, because as his understanding of the mind deepened, he discovered that conditions like his were often rooted, deeply hidden beneath the surface, in a wish to forget. Behind all of it, there was an unspoken fear. But forget what? Dick would ask David when the first textbooks on the new science came out. They were both learning the new terminology, Dick with enthusiasm, David with dismissive snorts. What are we supposed to forget? You had plenty to forget, David would reply steadily. I think this guy is an idiot, but you've had it rough. Your father's death for starters, and you came pretty close to dying yourself. You single-handedly fought the worst storm in a decade, ended up with double pneumonia, and spent about 56 hours alone in that cabin. Forgetting isn't exactly easy. Dick had never doubted David's story. He didn't doubt it now either. He had accepted it without question from the beginning, filling in the gaps in his childhood memories with David's account, weaving them together to reconstruct his past. The older man he vaguely remembered wasn't just his father. He was also David's brother, and he had died. According to David, the shock of his father's death had driven Dick into the mountains, where David had found him and nursed him back to health. It was all quite simple and even made sense with the new psychology. Not that he had cared much about psychology back then. He had been deeply lethargic, passive, and uninterested. Thinking was too much effort. True, he had retained certain instincts and a few mental images from those lost years. In the beginning, he had been frustrated by the limitations of relative poverty and had needed to learn the value of money. The memories he retained had a certain richness that reality didn't match. He remembered a large ranch house and countless horses grazing in meadows or swarming in a corral. But David had warned him early on that there was no estate. His future depended entirely on his own efforts. Then the new life had grabbed him and held on. For the first time he felt mothered and loved. Lucy was like a mother to him, and David was the role model he aimed to emulate. He was happy and content. Occasionally, in the beginning, he had a fleeting urge to go back and try to rebuild his past. He thought that filling the gap in his life would be easier surrounded by familiar things. But at first, he relied completely on David, and their money was tight. Later, as his new life took hold, with medical school and odd clerical jobs during vacations to help pay the bills, there simply wasn't an opportunity. Then the war came, and when he returned, there was his practice, and David's health wasn't great. As time passed, he grew increasingly aware of a strange reluctance to return, almost a fear. He had learned more about the mind and understood that mental stress, not physical hardship, caused lapses like his. But what kind of mental stress could have caused such a break? His father's death. Strain and fear, said modern psychology. Fear. He had never considered himself lacking in courage. He would have fought anyone who called him a coward. Yet cowardice was at the root of conditions like his. It was a refusal to face reality. It was weak. Weak. He despised himself for that past failure to confront reality. But that night, sitting by David's bed, he faced reality with a vengeance. He was in love, and he wanted everything that love should bring to a normal man. He felt normal. Strengthened by love, he felt ready to face whatever life had in store, as long as it also brought Elizabeth. He painfully replayed his conversation with David from the previous Sunday night. "Don't be an idiot," David had said. "Go after her if she's interested, and don't drag it out. I'm not getting any younger." "What I feel," he had replied, "is this. I don't know if she even cares." David grunted. "But I'm going to try to make her care if it's possible. Before things go any further, I'd like to visit the ranch again." "Why?" "I need to fill the gap. Try, at least." As he sat by David's bedside, he thought about David's reaction to his plan. David had been against it, offering a bunch of trivial, almost childish reasons. He showed a stubbornness and irritation that seemed, oddly enough, like fear. David afraid. David, who was as open as a book. David, whose eyes never wavered, whose courage never faltered. "Leave it alone, Dick," David had concluded. "You've got everything you need, and a doctor can't just wander off. When people need you, they need you." But he noticed David had been different since then. David kept watching him with his faded old eyes, and even mentioned retiring and handing over all the work to him. Was it possible that David didn't want him to go back to Norada? He leaned over and felt David's pulse. It was stronger, less rapid. The action took him back to his first memory of David. He had been lying in a rough bunk in a mountain cabin, David next to him on a wooden box, feeling his pulse. He had felt weak and utterly powerless, and realized now how sick he had been. The cabin had been small and lonely, with snow peaks not far above, and it had been very cold. During the day, a woman kept the fire going. Maggie moved around the cabin like a wisp of smoke. At night, she slept in a lean-to shed while David tended the fire. A man named John Donaldson, who seemed to know David well, would arrive at dawn every so often with food and supplies. As David regained his strength, Maggie eventually left, and he took over, frying bacon and heating up canned tomatoes or beans. Before she went, Maggie left him a biscuit recipe. David worked hard to follow it, only to end up with pans of burnt lumps, which frustrated him. David had little curiosity about his past. He lived a simple life, focusing on eating, sleeping, and tentative walks around the room as his legs trembled. As the snow nearly buried the cabin, David spent a lot of time reading and conversing now and then, trying to piece together his fragmented memories. That's how he discovered David was his uncle, and that his father had recently passed away. Some things still didn't make sense, like why they never returned to the ranch. When the snow started to thaw in the spring, Donaldson showed up with 2 saddled horses and a pack animal. They set off west over the mountains, leaving David standing in the clearing, unsure of the path. At one point, they were lost for 3 days. Looking at the figure on the bed, he realized how much had changed in 10 years. David, once vigorous and youthful, had aged significantly. Now he lay there as an old, worn-out man. He remembered the rides back then. David had seemed tireless. He had taken on the responsibility of the nightly camps, cutting a trail with his hatchet across snowy fields while Dick, still weak but loudly protesting, had to stand and watch. Reflecting back, and considering David's clear objections to his return to the West, he reviewed the details of that winter and spring. Why hadn't they followed Donaldson's trail, or returned to the ranch? Why, if Donaldson could make it, hadn't other visitors come? When he almost died and David sat under the lamp behind the tightly screened windows, reading the same pocket prayer book that now lay next to the bed, why wasn't another doctor brought in? Why had they burned his clothes? And why did Donaldson bring a new outfit? And why, despite his requests, did Donaldson never bring a razor, so that by the time they reached the railroad, far from anywhere, they were both fully bearded? He stopped himself abruptly. His imagination had run wild. He had been picturing a flight, and anyone who knew David knew he would never run away. Still, he felt a new uneasiness and anxiety. Once David recovered enough, he would go to Norada, just like he told Elizabeth, and find the Donaldsons to clear up his lingering questions. After that, he thought of Elizabeth, her sweetness and sanity. He remembered her at the theater the night before, lost in its imagined emotions and fake drama. He felt moved to comfort her when he found her on the verge of tears. "Just remember, they're only acting," he had said. Yes, but life does things like that to people. Not often. The theater mostly deals with dramatic exceptions. You and I, plain bread and butter people, come to see these things for a sort of vicarious thrill. Don't plain bread and butter people ever have anything happen to them? A little jam, sometimes. Or maybe they drop it, butter side down, on the carpet. That would be a tragedy, wouldn't it? He had to admit it might be, but he was pretty clear about the fact that most people didn't drop it. After a while, he fell asleep in his chair. The spring wind blew in through the open window and rustled the pages of the old prayer book on the table.